Hey everyone, it's Professor Snard here checking in. I'm feeling much better. I was under the weather for a bit, so I've kind of fallen behind. So I'm getting myself caught up, and I'll try to actually get us a little bit ahead here as well, since I'm sort of late checking into our current unit. It's Tuesday, March 6th in the morning as I'm recording this, looking out my window at it snow, which is weird and disappointing, although I doubt it will hang around for long. So anyway, hopefully you are having a good day so far. Let's take a quick look at our due dates relative to when I'm recording this, at least. So we've just finished up our sort of capstone project for our short fiction section of our class. We now move into poetry. Spend a couple of units on that. We actually then have sort of like a midterm spring break happening. Then we move into drama, and then we sort of wrap things up. So we're actually getting, relatively close to that midterm point in our course, even though watching it snow doesn't really help with that feeling exactly. So hopefully you've really settled into the pattern of the course and kind of how it's set up and how we move from unit to unit and interact with one another. How available I am as far as email and checking in and stuff like that. So you can always feel free to be in touch with me. And of course, if you're interested in or motivated to or have other questions that email is just not really answering, we can always meet face-to-face if you're on campus, or virtually if you happen to be, off campus, out of state, whatever the case might be. Okay, so we begin our poetry unit here, looking at our first due date of March 8th, and then turning around to that Sunday, March 11th, and then we spend another poetry unit looking at sonnets. Sort of a traditional form that I'll talk about here, again, trying to get us a little bit ahead of where we are. So for Unit 7, we're going to start our study of poetry by really thinking about that whole genre like as a thing, not even studying one particular poem. And so I start us off by reading/listening to this interesting poem or song. Like, how do we even differentiate those two? Because it's in our Norton book, really presented as a poem, just text on the page, but obviously it's performed by this artist as a song. So already, right out of the gate, I'm trying to get us to think about, or maybe even challenge, notions of what poetry is and where it occurs. By the same token, I want to be really careful and not suggest that every lyric is poetry, or every poem could become a song that's any good, like you'd want to listen to. In fact, one of the things that I notice when I teach the poetry writing class here at COD is that a lot of people, kind of like emerging poets, or people just learning the craft of poetry, they've learned about poetry in two primary ways. First of all, as kids in books like Dr. Seuss, for example, or even Shel Silverstein, which is a better example, but Dr. Seuss, right, we learn that kind of poetry. Play with language. It's very fun, right? It's kind of for your ear to hear more than your eye to see on the page, which is great, right? Immersing kids in language and making it available to them as a tool to play with, not this static thing that they're separated from. But we learn lots of lessons from that, like it has to rhyme. The rhymes are always perfect. That's kind of what makes Dr. Seuss fun. The other thing then that people learn poetry from largely isn't really from like a poetry textbook or books of poems that people buy at the bookstore or online. It's from lyrics. And unfortunately, those two sources, even though they're great in and of themselves, they kind of teach us some weird, maybe bad things about what poetry should be. Like it has to rhyme, it should be about certain subjects, or exist in a certain style, or be very abstract or philosophical. None of which is really true. So anyway, I offer up this challenge right here as we think about poetry, like what is it? How does it exist? Can it be the same sort of lines, but if presented differently, one is lyrics, one is poetry? So maybe blurring the line between lyrics and poetry here, even though I'd be the first to assert that not all lyrics are poetry. In fact, we run into a lot of problems if we make that mistake. Okay, enough about that. So the assignment here is to use the Padlet tool that we've used before in our class. Again, trying to do this as a mobile assignment, so you're not just Googling things and posting to the Padlet or digging up images from the web. Again, we want to think about like poetry, which for me is, like I say here, a lot of mixed baggage. So some people think it's kind of cool or hip, others think it's kind of weird, sort of cool because it's weird. You probably get the idea here. It's also, I think, both like really marginal in a cultural sense. Like you ask the average person, do you read any poetry? Do you write poetry? And most people outside of like our kind of college environment here probably won't be that interested. Again, the word poetry, the idea of it will have kind of that negative baggage attached to it, like it's a bunch of very depressed people smoking cigarettes and just being unhappy together, which is not true. But that's the, I think, kind of the stereotype or some of the baggage that's associated with. So it's really marginal, right? Outside of lyrics, probably most people don't really engage with poetry. However, if you think about it, and this is kind of what the assignment is getting us to do, poetry is also really, really central to our lives, to our public occasions, to our private occasions. So it's like at our most kind of important moments, whether they're big public moments, like I say here, private moments like a birthday, a wedding, literally a birth, a funeral, right? Positive and negative events in our life, we often turn to poetry. Either people write it or we read it as part of that event. So it's really kind of weird to me how poetry, like generically speaking, is really marginal. Most people don't think about it. And yet it's our go-to thing when something major is happening. So it's both really marginal on the outside, but also really, really central and kind of like woven into the fabric of our lives, even though we kind of don't notice it. So the Padlet then is designed to help us notice poetry that's actually out in the world, right? So your job for the Padlet is to find something, again, literally in your life. You don't just pull a poetry book off the shelf. That doesn't work. And you don't just want to Google something that's like poetic and post it to the Padlet. So you might be surprised actually at how, again, like how central or how present poetry is, but because we're not actively looking for it, we kind of don't notice it, or we think that it doesn't really exist in any of our public spaces. And by that I mean the spaces that we inhabit just as part of our life, not literally public parks, for example, but even your house or where you work, like those kind of places as well. Open spaces. Okay, so again, don't pull the English textbook off the shelf. We obviously know that poetry exists there, but it's hardly out in the open for people to interact with. You don't want to Google something. You don't want to just find something that is like quote unquote poetic or like beautiful or something that's lovely to look at, right? We're looking for actual words, actual text. Even if it doesn't seem like it is intending to be poetry, if it really is, if it's words organized on a page or on some graphic space, like a billboard, for example, that's poetry. And again, I think we're going to find it in some really, really surprising places. So be sure to get in here. Again, it's Tuesday. We have that Thursday due date. I'm not seeing any posts just yet, so try to be working ahead and not always right up against that due date. And again, there's really no way for me to check this, although I can always get a sense of it, but make this as authentic as possible. So don't realize that it's Thursday at like 10 p.m. So I'll just take a picture of kind of whatever I can find hanging around and reverse engineer that so it somehow fits the assignment. Yeah, you can do that, but it's not very authentic or very meaningful. And then, let's say I can kind of grab it just at the bottom. We do have this reply built in using just the standard, right, discussion board reply feature. So whatever someone posts in the Padlet, you can just reply to using the discussion board, again, by Sunday. Okay, so I'm going to jump us forward one unit here into our look at sonnets. So kind of moving from a really free form exploration of poetry as a whole genre, like a big idea, and then turning really to a recognizable, even fairly conventional, traditional type of form. The sonnet form, which most people have probably run into, and certainly you've heard that term before, even if you don't necessarily know all the rules that make a sonnet a sonnet. So we have a bunch that are assigned from our textbook here to read. They're relatively short. In fact, they're always 14 lines, which helps. And I'm not even concerned that you come away like understanding every nuance of every one of these sonnets. I offer this bundle of them more to help us see like the variety of them. So not only are there two very general different kinds of sonnets, there's the Shakespearean or Elizabethan or English sonnet, and then there's the Italian or Petrarchan sonnet, named for Petrarch, the kind of primary practitioner of that form. And that the two forms share a few things in common, but they also do have some differences. So there's two, right, kind of like sub-genres of the sonnet form. But you'll actually see a lot of variation, even if some of them are ostensibly all Shakespearean or Petrarchan or whatever. There's a lot of difference. In fact, some of them, like maybe this poem here, unless you were told it was a sonnet, it might have not even strike you as a poem in a particular form, or maybe this one that you've probably heard of before, but never even realized it was a sonnet. So a lot of the practitioners of the sonnet form take a lot of license with some of the rules. In fact, even Shakespeare famously breaks the rule, especially the iambic pentameter, the meter of the sonnet, on a fairly regular basis. And we'll talk about that in just a sec. And then this more contemporary one by Billy Collins, just called Sonnet, is a sonnet that kind of makes fun of the sonnet form itself, and you'll see how that works when you read it. He also makes an allusion or references Petrarch, the Italian, right, form of the sonnet as well. Okay, so your job here, and it's to help us really to hear sonnets and how they work as the metrical part of the kind of rules of the sonnet. So to help us do that, you're going to read through, right, the various ones collected here, and then you are going to record yourself doing one of them, whatever one kind of strikes your fancy, whichever one is most interesting, or even just sounds coolest to you. You don't have to have, again, like I said, this deep working knowledge of every single aspect of analysis of the thing. It's really more of a human engagement with the thing than an intellectual or somehow academic pursuit here. So you don't have to be on camera, just your face talking into the screen. You can get much more creative with how you present this, whether you film something or record yourself but then have sort of some still images, or maybe there's text on your screen that you're capturing. Maybe there's sock puppets involved. I'm not saying, I'm just saying. So get as creative as you want. So don't feel like, oh no, I have to now be just my face staring into the camera and weirdly reading this thing. So the other thing then is to not just read the thing. I don't really expect you to memorize them necessarily, although they are pretty short. But try to, like, I don't know, for lack of a better term, perform the sonnet, right? Say it. Don't just read it like words on a page. Try to really like understand the voice of the speaker in whatever poem you're choosing. Okay, setup is a pretty simple discussion board here. I'd encourage you to work in your portfolio space, load a YouTube clip in or whatever you want, and then provide the URL here. Usually works the best, and then we have the usual reply component. And I also provide the rules for sonnets just kind of so we can think about these, and I'll talk about the meter part in just a sec, because that's kind of the most, I would say, challenging part of sonnets. So I've taken Shakespeare's Sonnet 116, Let Me Not to the Marriage of True Minds. He never did title the sonnets, they were always just numbered. So if you see them titled in a textbook, they often have these square brackets around them, and the editors of the book have just used the first line of the poem as the title of the poem. It's not actually what Shakespeare would have titled it. Okay, so the rules. Always 14 lines. That's a pretty standard convention. The Shakespearean sonnet takes this particular rhyme scheme. So the first 4 lines, that quatrain or set of 4, divided into couplets or sets of 2. So we have this back and forth A, B, A, B. Notice that usually the rhyme is what we'd call the perfect rhyme, like minds, finds, mark, bark, shaken, taken. The sound of those words is like almost identical. But every once in a while, even sometimes just for reasons of different pronunciation, we'll run into what we call a slant rhyme, where the sound isn't perfectly matched together, but they sort of echo one another, like love, remove, again, maybe just pronounced differently. But even like proved, loved, it's not an exact perfect rhyme, but it's pretty close. But notice that we don't rhyme really throughout the whole thing. In other words, down here in the 3rd quatrain, cheeks come, weeks doom, we're not referencing backwards to the minds, love, finds, remove. So it's A, B, but we don't see an A and B show up again. So we just rhyme across the quatrain, A, B, C, D, E, F, and then the final couplet, kind of the summation part of the poem, we have a new rhyme scheme with the G and the G sound. If you want to it's interesting to know that the sonnet form was treated almost like we would treat an academic essay. It actually has component pieces. So the first quatrain was like laying out a premise, kind of an introduction to your essay. We have a couple of quatrains or like body paragraphs of development and variation and different sort of takes on the basic premise. And then our conclusion, or like I've got here, the basic summation here. We don't really need to worry so much about that, but I think it's important to realize that the sonnet isn't just a collection of 14 lines. It actually was used, especially in its most traditional format, almost like we would use an academic essay to put forward an argument, develop that argument and look for variation, and then, right, we close it up with this final, like, conclusion. Okay. The iambic pentameter part of it. This is probably the most, like I said, challenging part. And notice here that in addition to the reading aloud part, right, reading a sonnet, we're also going to be composing our sonnets, which is kind of where we're going here with our look at the form. So I'm not grading you on how awesome your sonnet is exactly, although I bet you will surprise yourself. I'm really more concerned with, do you get the gist of the form, like the rules, and can you basically follow them? And unlike the authors we're reading here, I'm hoping that people will more or less follow the rules, so don't try to vary or break them so much. So 14 lines, that's pretty easy. The rhyme scheme, right, is relatively easy to follow. Don't be so concerned with premise, variation, variation, summation, although you'd be surprised at how naturally that comes as you're writing a sonnet. And then, as much as you can, try to get the iambic pentameter part. Okay, so an iamb is a unit of, excuse me, a metrical unit within a line of poetry. And there's actually different kinds of these things. And it's all about where the stress or the not stress falls as we would speak the lines. So the iamb is a d sound, right? The unstressed, the small de, and then the duh, the stress of where we would where we would stress a syllable, for example, or the stress would fall in a word. And then we just repeat that 5 times, that's the pentameter part, across the line. So, and 1, and 2, and 3, and 4, and 5. And you can literally count on your fingers. In fact, most like sonnet writers, as we start out, that's exactly what we're going to do. And I give you some examples here, but I'll actually show you some better ones. So one of the other things that people often do is we make the mistake of starting on a stressed syllable and then the whole line is kind of upside down. So if you can start with what we'd normally say as a filler word like the, so, an, we would never stress that word as part of a sentence. So that's a great way to start, because then you know that you're getting off on the right foot. Like, the night is dark and blah, 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 and 5. It comes and goes and blah, and 4 and 5. Right? You can actually sort of get into the rhythm of it, and it gets much easier. So the 2 examples I want to show you, where the heck did I put them? Here they are. So let me not to the marriage of true minds. This is kind of a bad example, but I'm going to do it anyway. This is one of the rules that Shakespeare breaks all the time, is instead of starting on the unstressed, which you're supposed to do, he starts with the stressed, but then he actually finds his way into the rhythm. So I'm going to read it in a really artificial and clunky way, but clearly it's meant to be spoken. We're not supposed to really hear the metrical device, and I'm going to even annoy you with this part of it. Oh, isn't that nice? Okay. And 1, and 2, and 3, and 4, and 5. Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. Love is not love which alters when it alteration finds. So minds finds, right? You get the idea. And I read it in a clearly artificial way. Notice too how you really have to pause at that period so that the rhythm continues. Here's the best example that you can return to though. A more contemporary Edna St. Vincent Millay, an American 20th century poet. My favorite, probably one of my favorite sonnets, but also my favorite line is this very first one for how iambic pentameter works. And 1, and 2, and 3, and 4, and 5. What lips my lips have kissed, and where and why? What lips my lips have kissed, and where and why? Da 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 da, and 4 and 5. And then it actually goes on and stays fairly close to that iambic pentameter throughout. You can see her rhyme scheme is different, right? Because we are a slightly different sonnet form here. Okay, enough metronome. Thank you. All right, so this video is very long, longer than I want, but I'm trying to capture a couple of units and also this particular unit that has a couple of different assignments in it, both reading a sonnet aloud so we can hear that human aspect of it, and then also trying to create some of our own so that we understand what the rules are and seeing if we can't put those into place. Okay, as always, be in touch with me if you have questions, concerns, anything going on, and I will check in with everyone soon.